Is anybody here old enough to remember the expression fog of war? I think it may have originated in World War I, I'm not sure. But then when you get a war, you have a very difficult time getting reliable information about what's going on. There are several narratives about the Syrian civil proxy war, and that's what it is. A lot of great powers, or would-be great powers, involved in Syria. The United States and Russia are involved in a proxy war there. It's a civil war. The account Mr. Roth just gave is only one of two or three competing narratives. One narrative is, and in war, innocents die. That's why we're all anti-war. He says that the Russians joined with the Syrians in deliberate war crimes. This is based on very selective reports that come from sources that cannot be verified. For example, the white helmet man that you had testified to this didn't tell us how he knew that, how he observed it, how he escaped with his own life. Moreover, there are people who doubt the reports that come from the white helmets, that they have an agenda. So the rest of us are left here trying to weigh the different narratives. Mr. Ross is a very extreme set of accusations. What Samantha Power has said at the United Nations over a long period of time can't be taken at face value, because she has performed there not as an ambassador, but as a propagandist for a certain point of view. The problem here is that what's the alternative to ending the siege of Aleppo? Now, you, Amy, Mr. Roth, and the New York Times have dropped the word jihadist and terrorist from your narrative. I don't know if you're aware you've done that. You may have done this because the New York Times, until September, why was September important? Because President Obama had proposed to join with President Putin in what Mr. Roth now calls war crimes. That is, a military alliance against the people who were holding Aleppo captive, and they called them terrorists. When our Department of Defense sabotaged that potential Russian-American alliance in Aleppo, in Syria, suddenly the narrative, and we're back to the fog of war, changed. The New York Times, for example, and many of us who depend on the Times or the Washington Post for our information, suddenly changed the narrative. There were no longer any terrorists in Aleppo, no longer any jihadists, but people called rebels. And since our nation began in rebellion against Great Britain, rebels have a rather positive connotation. The reality is, I think, at least this is what the United States government told us until September, that terrorists were holding large parts of eastern Aleppo. They were not letting innocent civilians use the multiple corridors out of the city that the Russians, yes, there's plenty of testimony to this, had opened up and guaranteed that people could not escape the city because of these terrorists. Then suddenly, when the American-Russian Obama's plan to cooperate with Putin there disappeared, apparently all the jihadists and the terrorists disappeared. So we're left today in a fog of war. Perhaps Mr. Roth is correct, but I don't think he's fully correct. And we have two narratives. Either we have witnessed the liberation of Aleppo, and then we would say this is a good thing, or we're witnessing war crimes by the Russians and the Syrians in Aleppo, which is a bad thing. So I would ask Mr. Roth, if the Russians hadn't done what he alleged they would do, what was the alternative to setting the people of Aleppo free?
Well, the United Nations has issued conflicting reports. There's a bit of a struggle at the United Nations about what to say about all this. Look, Mr. Roth's organization does God's work, no question about it. But for millennia, we've argued exactly what God's work is. One can support what Human Rights Watch does with great enthusiasm, make a donation, urge Mr. Roth on, and still question his narrative.
He asserts absolutely verifiable sources. The reality is he doesn't. He criticizes me for saying fog of war, but there are other reports that have to be taken into account. The charge that Russia deliberately targets civilian facilities and centers is, of course, part of the growing anti-Russian line that's captured our politics and has led to the scandal in Washington. I think we need to step back for a minute. And I won't speak of my own involvement in human rights or civil liberties because I'm older than both of you, and I would have you at a disadvantage because I'm not sure you even remember these struggles. You do, but I'm not talking about only in the South, but in Russia and elsewhere. Putin said prior to sending his Air Force to Syria, just over a year ago in September 2015, I think, said it at the United Nations. He said it to President Obama. He said it at every press conference. During the period, 3-year period prior to that, the United States claimed it was fighting the Islamic State. And of course, Mr. Roth is right. There are different terrorist groups fighting in Syria, some in Palmyra, some in Aleppo. During the 3 years, the United States claimed to have been fighting the Islamic State. The Islamic State gained more and more and more territory after the fall of Libya, or after we overthrew Gaddafi. It gained more territory in Iraq, and it gained an enormous territory in Syria, and something new emerged in the world. A terrorist organization that had actually turned itself into a real state. I mean, it was governing these territories, running municipal facilities, collecting taxes. This was something new and exceedingly dangerous. So Putin said we have a choice. Who do we want in Damascus, the capital of Syria? Do we want Assad, the president of Syria, or do we want the Islamic State in Damascus? This was the key policy difference between the United States and Russia. The Obama administration had pursued, in fact, a policy of overthrowing Assad, dealing with terrorists in Syria, some of whom we funded, as Mr. Roth well knows, because they claimed to be anti-Assad, meant that, in fact, as we pursued the war against Assad, the Islamic State took more and more territory, and Russia decided it had had enough because it believed Syria was vital to its national security. And it intervened, and the war has been turned around. The United States has been on the wrong side of history from the beginning of this. The United States has made its contribution, since Vietnam at least, to the destruction of hospitals and civilian facilities, most recently in Afghanistan. Was it deliberate? I don't know. It was probably an accident. In Mr. Roth's absolutist view, everything is certain, everything is deliberate. I'm more problematic. But look what's happening in Syria today. It's extremely interesting. The Russians and the Syrians, some months ago, took back Palmyra, this historic city, where the Islamic State had been chopping off heads in public, where it had lined up its victims and had young children, looked to be about 10, 11, 12, execute them. I'm sure Human Rights Watch reported that and protested it. And then the Russians and the Syrians liberated the city. Now Palmyra is under siege again. The Islamic State may take control of the city. What's the United States doing about it? This is what we should be asking. This is our country now, not Russia. Let me finish my point. You filibustered. Let me just make my last point. He hasn't mentioned Mosul, by the way, and whether the same thing is happening in Mosul. The American-led... One second, please. There are verifiable reports that jihadists in Mosul are fleeing because of the Iraqi-American war there. Where are they going? They're going to Syria. The United States has bombers in that area. They could stop these people from going to Syria. They're headed, I would guess, toward Palmyra. Why is the United States allowing these jihadists, these terrorists, to go to Syria? Because possibly they want them to take back Palmyra from the Russians and the Syrians. Now, we don't know if that's true, but the American role is highly suspect. And rather than sit here and say the Russians are committing war crimes, because, look, one person's war crime is another person's liberation. On the front page of the New York Times this very morning, there's a story by Ann Barnard. By the way, Americans are not filing from Syria, that they're filing from Beirut. So they're depending on different sources. But she makes an interesting point. She repeats what Mr. Roth says that about people being executed by the Syrian army. But she goes on to say these can't be verified. And then 2 or 3 paragraphs later, she reports that people trapped in Aleppo are welcoming the Syrian army with jubilation. She reports. So even in the New York Times, which has not been very helpful in these narratives, you see the two narratives. And undoubtedly, part of what Mr. Roth said is absolutely true. Part of it is part of the position that he has taken more generally about Russia being mainly responsible for virtually everything that bad is happening in the world. And I just end by saying that in my judgment, the real threat to our national security at this moment, number one, is not unfolding in Syria, but in Washington, D.C.